All right, everybody, and we are back with episode 6, chapter 5 of our breakdown of Robert Davis's book, Purpose in Form, the Necessary Basis of All Ethics. Um, this is going to be chapter 5, The Myth of Secularism. But first, before we get started, how are you today, Rob? How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing good, doing very well. What's that shirt? It's a Jasmine.
Oh, it's the my Uncle Iroh shirt, the Jasmine Dragon,
Ooh, fantastic.
Bossing Say. Yep.
Wow, much better than my I got kind of a plain blue shirt on, but hey, you know what? Something wrong with a blue shirt. Nothing
Yep.
wrong with a blue shirt. Okay, so I figured the best thing to do going into this chapter would be to uh define what secularism is. Uh could you do that for us, please?
Yeah. So in this case, I'm talking about a conception of society as um, with existing and operating without religion. Now, I'm not talking about the separation of church and state. The separation of church and state is actually something that comes out of biblical tradition and Christianity itself. Um, it's existed since the Old Testament. It's because people have a skepticism of fallen people in power. So I'm not saying that there's anything wrong or needs to be changed about separation of church and state. When I'm saying secularism, I'm using it in the modern sense. I'm drawing from authors such as Yuval Noah Harari and Steven Pinker, who both praise the secular society. And at the end of the chapter, I do talk about some concessions and say, hey, there are some things that we should hope that are emulated that we usually think of as secular. But in terms of the core idea and the proposal and the conceptions that underlie secularism, I think they're all I think they don't work. And they're pretty flimsy actually when you start to look at them. So that's what the chapter is about, is we have this conception of the way that Noah Harari describes it is he says, I have a quote from him here. Secularism is a very positive and active worldview defined by a coherent code of values. It's sometimes just defined as the negation of religion, what we don't believe and what we don't do. But he's also saying it's a very active, positive thing. And he says secularism can provide us with all the values we need. And basically, he takes this image of secularism and paints it as the rosy conception of all the good things and none of the bad things. Um, and it just is complete nonsense. I mean, secularism is not a coherent code of anything, certainly because it doesn't have a foundation, as we'll get into. It also is not a good code of values. So, yeah, that's what we're talking about. That sort of conception of the world is life scrubbed of religion, life between people where we never talk about religion and things seem hunky dory, which is sort of just the modern status quo, the temporary status quo. But
Now, do you feel like there's an inherent level of potential manipulation with those that hold a secularist belief system? Like, do you feel like those that are more religious minded are a little less likely to maybe follow along with certain ideologies or certain individuals like Harari, who maybe look to fill in a vacuum of religion?
I do think there's an issue with the sort of uh, latent energy that secularism leaves lying around, and I think we'll get to that later, where we talk about um, how secularism puts the highest value on politics. Um, but I don't think it's really helpful to speculate on which group is more prone to a particular group think. Like we're all going to be prone to be manipulated in certain ways. and then it's more helpful to look at certain people and say, how are you evaluating things? How are you taking in counter evidence and that sort of stuff? And I think the alarming thing is that secularists talk a very good talk, and they're all about science and the virtues of questioning and not taking dogma and whatnot. But then they come up with a pretty shallow and shoddy dogma that they all are like, oh yeah, this is great. And you're like, uh, this doesn't make any sense. And so uh it can be, I think it can be a little bit disconcerting and alarming to see people go from the ever modest, skeptical proponent of inquiry to, say, for example, the uh, people calling the government to tell on you for not wearing a mask in your own car, kind of thing.
Right. Right.
And think, well, okay, maybe we can't just consider any singular system the be all end all, and it actually depends on uh, not only mouthing values but acting them out and making sure that they lead to good outcomes.
And then even earlier on in the chapter here, and just kind of sticking on the topic of Harari, because I think he is kind of one of the main spokesmen for upholding kind of a secularist ideology. Uh, he even explicitly says that meaning does not exist, that all our ideals and purposes are unimportant outside our own heads, and even points out the problem of passing the buck of meaning. So
Yeah.
what I don't understand is if somebody touts uh the unimportance of meaning and pushes the whole idea of meaninglessness, how does he have an inherent drive to write books or to be the henchman of Klaus Schwab with the World Economic Forum? If there's no meaning, I mean, wouldn't he just be in a dark corner somewhere infested with rats and spider webs sucking his thumb until he passes away?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm gonna say something nice about Harari that I saw recently, um but I'm gonna do that because I extensively take him to task in this book and think that um the audacity of him putting out the concentrated nonsense that he did and posing as an intellectual is just astounding. But so his book, early on in it, he says that we're being taken over by nihilism. And then when he explains nihilism, he explains it as nationalism. And so he basically equates, he says, anyone who doesn't say this verbatim, but essentially his point is anyone who's not on board with globalist design is a nihilist because they're too nationalist. And it's like, what? Like, you can't be an if you're a nationalist, you're not a nihilist because you believe in the goodness and power of the nation. Um, anyhow, then he also talks about how our consciousnesses are meaningless and that they don't mean anything outside ourselves, and we're all sad and our lives are pretty crummy. And then he sets all that up in the beginning of his book, but then he concludes the book, and we're talking about 21 lessons for the 21st century right now. But he concludes the book by saying that the core and future of life lies in the mystery of consciousness. And it's like, wait a minute, is consciousness a mystical mystery, or is it nonsense, meaningless stuff in a broken ape? Like,
Yeah.
you can't get both. There's so many things, and I point out more in the book where you're just like,
Yeah.
I don't like it's astounding.
A lot of it,
But
like, yeah, go
hold
ahead.
on, let me say my positive about him. I did hear him recently say that he's been considering the necessity of nationalism, and I think he said something like he thinks that nationalism will be an inevitable part of the future, which is like that's progress. He's changing his mind because before in this book he was saying that any thoughts of nationalism were equivalent to nihilism. So he's been willing to consider another side at least, and coming around to that. And I do think that our only real hope for a functional world lies in some form of non-zero sum nationalism, where people have large groups that they're connected to, that don't get so big that people are completely disconnected, but that we interact in a positive non-zero sum manner. So he seemed to be at least open to that and reconsidering stuff. So that's a good thing.
I mean,
Kudos.
I gotta look at that, okay? Because like he's like the epitome of globalism. I mean,
Yeah.
that would be like somebody, some executive at the top of Coca-Cola saying that he's open to trying Pepsi products.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like, it's just I gotta check that
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
But I mean, who knows? I mean,
So so from there, let's go to let's talk about Steven Pinker for a minute.
okay, yeah.
Because I have a lot more respect for Steven Pinker, and I really enjoyed his book, Enlightenment Now. And he also goes heavy on um, lauding secularism and talking about the Humanist Manifesto and all the benefits that it brings along with it. Well, he he does a similar thing, actually, but he dresses it up a little bit better. He talks about the Humanist Manifesto, and he says straightforwardly that it is not designed to be deep philosophy. And that has a certain amount of appeal, especially in America and some of the modern West, where we're have a strong anti-intellectual streak, and I get that. But to say to pretend, I mean, the fact he's doing a bunch of philosophy in the rest of his book, and then he's lauding something. He's like, "Oh yeah, well, it doesn't get too philosophical, you know. It's not deep philosophy." It's like, I mean, a lot of people will take that as a positive, but the issue is if you're looking for something to be a foundational central core belief and you think it's not going to be deep philosophically, like that means it's not foundational and core, it's surface level. So I think that's a flaw, much more of a flaw than they in he or the humanist manifesto people realize, because they sort of state it forthrightly like it's a good thing on their side. But he goes through and he states all these precepts of the humanist manifesto. You know, they consider human life as sacred. Like,
You're
okay,
talking
but
about the Humanist Manifesto right now, right? Okay.
yes, yeah. He's quoting it in his book, but he's quoting directly from the Humanist Manifesto. He says that one of their values is they consider life to be sacred. Okay, what does sacred mean? If you don't if you don't believe in
Yeah.
God, if you don't believe in a foundation of sacredness, what does sacred mean? Now, okay, well, it doesn't, we're using it metaphorically. It just means that we're going to respect this above all other things. We're going to make sure that human life is our highest value. Okay, but rationalism is already sort of your highest value. So what if rationalism starts pushing arguments against the value of human lives? For example, like in David Benatar, he's very rationalistic. Like, how do you resolve a conflict between rationality and the value of human life if rationality seems to be pretty heavily weighted against human life? If you just start saying, well, we already accept the precept that human life is sacred. Great, now you have a dogma. You have a religious dogma that says human life is sacred because we said so. And then all the people who were attracted to Humanist Manifesto through the want to value rationality and objective inquiry are going to fall on the side of rationality. And they're going to, wait a minute. We're not supposed to be shutting down questions based on dogmas. We're supposed to be following rationality wherever it goes. And then people on the life is sacred side will be like, well, but life's sacred. We shouldn't entertain arguments that go against that, then you just have a religious dogma set up again where you can't question certain, and the people who are attracted by rationality are going to have the exact same problems with the Humanist Manifesto that they have with any other religion. So it really solves no problem, and it intentionally gives a shallow and surface level just statement of faith. So they've solved no problems and they've made their own problems worse. So and I think this is Steven Pinker does the best job at setting it up and defending this sort of view. But even in his own assessment, he's showing these weak links, and he doesn't talk about them. He skipped them. Oh, of course we'll value human life. Of course it's good to pursue knowledge. Of course it's good to pursue the continuation of the human species, blah, blah, blah. No actual explanation for why that is, or why we should believe it, or why we should go against rationality that's pointing in the opposite direction, like David Benatar. Basically, I think he just doesn't take any of that seriously and doesn't realize how seriously people are actually moved by that sort of argument.
Would you say though that Steven Pinker comes across as being as nihilistic as, let's say, Benatar or even Harari does? I
No,
mean,
he's
yeah,
definitely not as nihilistic. The problem is he just has no support, no explanation for why he believes the things that he believes. He believes that it's good to pursue knowledge. He believes that it's good to pursue human flourishing. He believes that life is sacred. That's great. But he's also heavily invested in a tradition that says we are absolute about questioning everything, about asking why of everything, and not settling for dogma. That's like the core of the rationality over religion people. And then if you end up in a place where rationality goes against human propagation and the worth of human life and meaning and all that, then in Steven Pinker's position, he's only left with, well, that of course that's not true. Why? Because that would be bad if it was true. And we said it's not. We already agreed it's not. So it's not true. Again, it just comes back to a central dogma that they've stated. So the issue isn't that he's as nihilistic, it's that he is the most vulnerable to nihilism. He has no defense against nihilism. And he actually opens his own book with a case of a student who's asking a very nihilistic question. And he gives him a very well worded and nice sounding rationalistic answer that would definitely work for anyone who is already of the mindset of the good modern rationalist who inexplicably considers life as sacred. Great. The problem is people are legitimately bothered by nihilistic considerations. And if you are legitimately bothered by nihilistic considerations and you believe in rationality, then there's no way you're going to settle for life is sacred just because. That's not a good explanation.
so would you say that's the fundamental problem with secularism, is that you are more inclined to be vulnerable to a nihilistic belief system?
Yeah, nihilism is like their unwanted child. Like it
Right.
clearly follows from the precepts of secularism, but they don't want to talk about it
And
and they
so,
don't want to deal with it.
you know, and so something like that, like humanism that Pinker would bring up, is just kind of fluffing it out and making it sound good. And I believe later on in the chapter, you even throw a couple olive branches to secularism, just in terms of their baseline virtues and how they may just grab people who think like, oh well, yeah, I want to be a good person, and and so that's how they just kind of get you in, so to speak. And then next thing you know, you're a full blown, potentially a full blown nihilist, because you've kind of created that dogmatic belief set around that. And then my second question would be, honestly, if the repercussions of being a nihilist in today's society culminates in a complete lack of meaning. And so there's no drive to accomplish, there's no drive to do anything because there's no motivation, there's nothing beyond yourself that is pulling you to some great personal success or success on a grand scale. How are people like Harari high functioning? How are people that like that actually high functioning members of society and getting
Right.
doing certain things?
Right, exactly. That's I think that, well, for one thing, we should say, I think we've said before, but you actually cannot coherently act out a nihilistic worldview because it is incoherent. We always act with a purpose towards a meaning, no matter, like, even if you're propagating nihilism because you believe in it, you are acting towards the propagation of nihilism. That's your purpose because you believe in the meaning of nihilism. So, so to say, well, why are they inconsistent? It's like, well, you can't actually be a consistent nihilist, first of all. But in the case of secularists, they, I mean, it's essentially well recognized at this point, though some people still contend it, but I don't think there's an actual good argument against it. Is the modern secularists take a watered down form of Judeo-Christian values, like life is sacred, and say, okay, we just accept these, strip them of religious language and just accept them as a veneer. It's good to pursue human flourishing. It's good to pursue knowledge. Human life is sacred. Mention a couple of other ones. A few people have different things here and there, whatever, and they just accept those just because they won't talk about the underlying reasons why. Oh, of course. Well, we evolved to care about people. Okay, but if we evolved as meaningless beings for no purpose, why does it matter what we evolve towards?
Right.
They take as a given, as a dogma, as a priori axiom of that the continuation of biological life is a good thing. And the problem is there are plenty of people who go, I don't know if that's true, and here's a bunch of rational arguments why it's not true. And there's no real response to that from within the secular point of view. So their inconsistency is there for sure as a necessity because you can't be a consistent nihilist. And then all of their virtuous action comes from holding on to Judeo-Christian values and acting them out, even though they say they don't believe in them.
So that's the
And
inherent, yeah,
yeah, and anything that they'd act out in the nihilistic direction is destructive and spreads, depression and angst and suicidality and worse. So yeah,
did you see Jonathan Pajot's breakdown of the Olympics opening ceremony?
I saw one of them. I think he did another one. I saw
He
the
did.
first one.
Yes, it was he kind of like attributed it to a carnival scene.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's what comes to mind, when you think of just kind of, oh well, what did we observe? Well, it was just a bunch of chaos, it was just meaninglessness. There was no real, I mean, of course there was symbolism and there was some other things going on in there, but just the average objective view of it is just nothing. It's gobbledygook, it's like a Nickelodeon episode playing out in front of you. Uh,
Yeah.
but then
Uh,
also they tie it around, with the Last Supper, and of course they denounce that and everything. And so even there was an attribution to Judeo-Christian belief systems, regardless of if it was meant to be a mockery or not, which clearly it was. But I
yeah.
think that's what ties into it is this nihilistic, even pandering maybe to secularists, because I don't think that it would have offended a secularist. It would only have offended a Christian, maybe even anyone else of uh, an organized faith or of the Abrahamic faiths. I think it would have been potentially uh, seen as mockery. But if you're a secularist, it's just, oh wow, that's interesting. Nickelodeon
Yeah, or Nickelodeon or high art,
or high art, right? Or high.
right? If you're being, where the goal is, that I don't have my thoughts fully formed on it, but that could be another one of the issues with secularism, where when you just have these sort of shallowly etched out values that you've inherited and watered down, then like, well, we're pursuing human flourishing. Well, you could conceive of the flourishing of art as just continually getting more, chaotic and avant-garde and ooh, here's something you didn't expect, just like basically turning in all art into messing with the viewer, right? Like, oh, if we just undermine your preconceptions as much as possible, then we're just getting more and more artistic. Now the definition of art is um what? Zany creativity.
Right.
Like,
Oh, it's so avant-garde.
yeah,
Oh,
exactly that. So, and there's not really a solid argument against that within secularism, because anything could be anything, because really there's no meaning, but we just have these few rules that we follow of, like, basically don't be a nihilist because we said so. But you can be a chaotic demon as much as you want. Just don't be a nihilist,
right. You can be
because demons don't exist and there's no real point to anything. So you can, you
right.
know, do whatever you want. But
You can be one because they don't exist. So you
yeah,
can
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
so
So,
you can
anyways, on secularism, on that point, sort of, Pinker dresses it up. Pinker makes as best a case you can make for it, I think. And a lot, again, I don't want to sell him short. A lot of people, as I say in the book, a lot of people will read his work and they will be perfectly satisfied with it. I'm not denying that. Plenty of people would think that's as deep as you need to go. He says good things. I agree with him. That's that. Why would you need anything more? Fair enough. But again, as we talked about in the first episode, this book is for people who are in the grips of nihilism, who are in the depths of despair. And that simply does not work for them. They will not settle for the dogmatic responses in secularism. So Pinker dresses it up nicely. The issue is Harari comes along and is lauding secularism and is being, hey, I'm a good secularist guy. I believe all the good things. Yay, science. Yay, progress, all that stuff. But he just comes out and says human rights don't exist.
right.
So, one step down the line, you have a top intellectual forwarding secularism who says, let me see, um, this is a direct quote from Harari: the only place that rights exist is in the stories humans invent and tell one another. It isn't true that humans have a natural right to life or liberty. Let me repeat that, and I'll take out the conjunction or the contraction so it's more clear. It is not true, according to Harari, not true that humans have a natural right to life or liberty.
Right. Yeah.
Okay,
That's one
that's
of
the
the most,
problem with secularism, is
and
that
he's one of the most influential people alive.
right. It's not like this is some wacky person who's taken the beliefs way off the rails and isn't, leading a fringe movement. He's a top intellectual. And so while Steven Pinker can do it very artfully and arguably stay within acceptable bounds, there's nothing holding other people to that same standard. And it's perfectly within the bounds of secularism for someone just to come forward and say, hey, you know what? Humans don't have any rights, including to life or liberty.
Yeah,
So that's an issue. Like, that's a problem.
it's a huge
That's
issue. It's a huge
secularism.
issue. And see, there you go. So we let's say we've knuckled down that Harari isn't necessarily in the pits of despair of
Yes.
nihilism, clearly,
Yeah.
but he takes advantage of the vacuum that secularism provides. And he fills that with the idea that freedom and liberty are not inherent. And so then
Yeah.
by that vacuum, him and others can instill any form of totalitarianism or authoritarianism, socialism, kind of anything else to fill in that void, you know?
Right. So he's still abiding by the principle of reason, and he's lauding the value of truth. And from his point of view, he's being an exceptionally honest and truthful person. He's willing to, I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that that is good intention behind it. But you could easily see someone in that position where they're like, look, I believe in reasonability, I believe in truth, the value of truth, and I'm just going to be as honest and truthful as I can. The reality is our rights don't exist. And he might, adjust that. He might fluff it up. He might say, they exist in the stories we tell us, and we don't have actual, real, natural, God-given rights, but we should still respect the rights that we decide to give each other arbitrarily. It's like, okay, but the problem is you've still foundationally said that there's no inherent rights in human life, including to human life. So again, even the people who aren't themselves consumed by nihilism, as they're handing forward and handing the baton of secularism, they're handing the the seeds of nihilism as well. Like anyone who takes that seriously and says, "Wait a minute, all of our beliefs are just nonsense hallucinations in our heads, and we don't have any rights." That grows in a certain direction in across many, as you pass it on to many minds, many people will take that in the same direction and go, well, if I believe that that's the case, therefore now I get to do X horrible thing.
Right.
So that's sort of the core issue of secularism, is that they're propagating nihilism at the same time and within a belief system that has zero defenses against nihilism.
That's exactly it. There's no defense. There's no defense. So it's easily filled in with something much more diabolical. And I would go as far as to say as Harari is a demon. I mean, this guy to me, like if you think of somebody that is anti-human, it's him right there in the dictionary. It's a picture of Ferrari right next to anti-human. But let's go ahead. Let's go into the idea of utopia, right? The secularist idea of utopia. Could you go into detail about that, of how it's always just in the future? It's always just, oh, well, it's always right there, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So this, I think, is something that is more or less universal to humans. Like we're always looking forward to a better state. But I think it comes to a head in secularism and in modern progressivism. And part of the issue is the, what secularism is left with, that they can still appeal to, is the idea of progress, right? So other Christianity can appeal to the world to come. Islam can appeal to a heavenly afterlife, what have you. Um, the the secularists, where they get their hope, where they place their hope, is in human progress, right? I mean, that's essentially the humanist manifesto, is we can make good progress and get good things. The issue with that is that progress progress inherently recognizes that we are now in a place that it is not good to be in, and we should be going to some better place. So you've already inherently recognized that there's something wrong. There's something potentially vastly wrong. And then again, you have the door open to the nihilists who, like David Benatar, makes the case that things are so bad that human life is a detriment in all cases. So the idea of progress is not really a sufficient solution to that, because within a secular worldview where you're mostly materialist, okay, maybe I am living in a generation that helps progress go forward, but we are centuries at least, if not millennia, away from uh, human life cultivated to a point where everyone has plenty and there's minimal, negligible suffering going on. We are far from that, and we've been soaked in a world of horror for so long, and we're going to continue to be. And so there's no reason within secularism to that stops you from looking at that and saying, maybe this was all a mistake. Maybe we just need to scratch the slate and not keep playing this game. Again, the only thing you have is oh, life is sacred, so we won't go down that road. Okay, but you also believe in rationality, and rationality is telling us life is terrible. And just because maybe some people in the distant future will not have as terrible lives does nothing for me as an individual living in this horrifying world right now. So the idea of utopia is a promise that doesn't really do what it needs to do when it remains a promise. And I think there's a recognition of that, of like, you know, an always coming utopia is not sufficient to help the people here and now. And so that, I think, bleeds into the modern need for utopia to happen right now. We don't just want to hope for utopia. We need utopia to be instantiated now so we can get out of the nihilist trap of being in a horrible world and not having anything to justify it.
What does utopia look like, and how could we get that now? Is that something that is relative, or is utopia a pretty solid benchmark you think that we could achieve?
So utopia is going to look different based on your worldview, right? The utopia you hope for is going to be determined by your assumptions about human nature and the good life. So it's funny. I was just rewatching the Back to the Future series,
Hmm.
and in each one it makes a point of showing, some weird thing that Doc has put together, like uh clicking and winding machinery that like makes breakfast for you or opens the paper for you and so like at least maybe there's a little bit less of that now, but you know for a while we had the idea that just automated everything is going to be better, right? Like
Right, right.
it's too much of a tax on me to cook my own breakfast or open my own newspaper or whatever it is. So to some people, at least for some time, utopia looked like you know something turning the pages of your book for you and cooking all your meals and that sort of stuff. So and then in religious views, it's going to be based on the religion, right? Christianity is the the city of God, or the kingdom of heaven, with Christ ruling and reigning, and people having plenty and no suffering and all that. And different denominations emphasize different things. Um, so, but utopia is essentially the the achievement of the good life, where you can look around and you can just be like, this is the good life. We are living the good life. You could make an argument that a utopia could exist where there would still be some difficulty, there'd still be some struggling, but that could be part of the good life because you'd have good things or whatever it might be. Um, but essentially, yeah, the utopia is the end of your system, is the achievement of the goals you set out to achieve. And for secularism, technological and intellectual progress is essentially, even in people who won't admit that it's infinite, it at least extends so far ahead of us that we can't see the end and we're nowhere close to it. So so again, it's not something that we're in the materialist view that we're actually legitimately expecting to come tomorrow, but at the same time, you're forced into a position where in order to try to get out of the nihilist saying, hey, life's really bad, maybe we need to give up, maybe we need to do something else, the nihilist poking that soft spot. I think that's part of what drives the secularists to say, or not to say, but to have this need to enact utopia as soon as possible, to bring about the the New Deal or the Great Society, or the I forget what the Chinese version was, but whatever the new great thing that's just about to come, if we can just get rid of the old people getting in the way, kind of thing.
Right.
So,
Yeah, there's always that desire of emergence, like a snake shedding its skin, something's
mm,
attempting to be birthed out of the old. And that idea is always intended to be utopia for the next generation. We're going to cast away the burdens and the shell of our forefathers that have been holding us back, and we're going to be able to envision that future that we've wanted, only to realize that it causes its own problems.
yeah,
Um,
that's a really that's a good description of the modern utopia strive. It's interesting though because it is a very modernist notion. Because for the most part, you can see there the idea that, oh, it's just the forefathers holding us back. Like that's a very modern view. For the most part, in world history, people looked back to their forefathers and said these people laid a great foundation and they were going in the right direction, and we stand on their backs as on giants
yeah.
in order to be where we are today. Whereas the modern utopist says, ah, no, we are the new species. We are the whatever, the star seeds, the indigo children, the enlightened ones, the special ones who really get it. We're just born superior. And the real problem throughout the whole world has been everyone else before us. They all have been propagating nonsense. And what would really save us is if we nixed them and did our own thing without really learning from them at all, because they're stupid and useless and have just been holding us back. That is the form of the day, but it's a very new form, and it's very modern in its essence of looking back with such animosity at the past.
And so we could also say that I mean, in relativity, let's say somebody that lived 400 years ago, does a time warp and shows up today, and they're flipping, the faucet and water's coming out. They go in a room, there's like 100 degrees outside. They go in a room, it's 70, and they might say like, wow, this is utopia.
Right.
So I see it is relative in that respect. I mean, we can see the atrocities that are going around in the world today, um, just incredible things that the mind can't even conceive the atrocities, but we're not really, it's not really brought to light in your everyday world. So I guess, in retrospect, somebody that lived 400 years ago coming in today might actually experience this as being utopia. I do want to bring up a point that you bring up on page 119, just talking about how, let's say, things have gotten better in recent years, just in terms of some of the scientific discoveries, just different things that have helped us. You say, regardless of the shrinking numbers, and I'm assuming you're talking about deaths and atrocities.
Mhm.
with just one case of rape, genital mutilation, torture, etc., should be unjustifiable for one to whom life is truly sacred. So, in essence, then, a truly utopian society would be one without any of that, not even a single one, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially dealing with someone of the mindset of like Benatar, that's definitely going to be the case. I'm also reading through the Gulag Archipelago, and Solzhenitsyn said something pretty interesting that I think triggered something in me because I've heard many times about the enormous numbers of people Stalin had killed, but I don't look at Stalin like when someone says the name Stalin, or even if someone says the name Hitler, I don't look at this as a person who is infinitely more evil than another random bad person. Like, and partly I think my like human mind is just we don't get big numbers. So 100 million, 20 million, a million, like the magnitude of difference between those things is just not uh that comprehensive, at least to me, is not that comprehensible. But Solzhenitsyn made this point. He told a particular story about some peasants that Stalin had killed, and there were six of them. And he said, for if nothing else, solely for the lives of those six peasants, Stalin deserved to be drawn and quartered. And I was like, based on the story and based on what you're saying, I was like, oh, he's right. Like we execute people for the death of one person.
Right.
The unjust death of six people, like, yeah, like that's something that throughout history, humanity would have been like, this person is atrocious. Like they need an atrocious death, tear them apart. I'm not actually like advocating for drawing and quartering. I'm just saying we can get lost in statistics and numbers and well, he oversaw the deaths of 20 million people or 100 million people or whatever it was, and there's sort of just a distance from that where it's like here's a story about six people, he deserves death for that.
Think about how many people, millions.
Right. And then it's like, okay, but he didn't just kill six people. That same story multiplied by thousands, tens of thousands, millions. It's like that's it's incomprehensible the levels that goes to. So
And
but that just ties into, I think what I'm trying to say there with the quote you read is that the secular point of view is fragile,
Mhm.
right? If you don't have redemption, like you don't have a mechanism for redemption and the salvation of individual people, not just a distant future state where some people will live in goodness, but the people who paved the way for that. If there's no meaningful integration of those people, not just in legends, not things that we pay lip service to giving them credit, but an actual meaning in their suffering, then you have a fragile worldview. And in the case of a world that's full of rape and disease and scarcity and theft and poverty and abuse and all that sort of stuff, not only does the secularist worldview not shield you, maybe shield is not the right, but not reinforce you, not strengthen you to live in such a world. It really doesn't even give you the excuse to live in a world where one of those occurrences happens. Just one, if you really believe human life is sacred, then what has been enacted on earth, even if it only happened once, is an atrocity, isn't a sin, a, a, a cosmic sin against the sacredness of human life. By definition, if you consider life as sacred, the violation of that is the worst thing possible. And just one example would be enough to delegitimize the existence of the world. So, unless you have a system that somehow is able to justify is not a good word, but is able to that goodness is robust enough to supersede, transcend, and redeem such a world, um, then you don't have a world that can, you don't have a system that can function in this world.
It brings to mind too, and I mean, I do want to go on to our next topic, but thinking about Stalin again, for example. So if he committed all of these atrocities, let's say he committed, a million atrocities, and you as a secularist, your idea of a utopia, the value that you hold is not one of these atrocities should occur.
Yep.
If you had the opportunity to enact revenge upon Stalin for committing these atrocities, you would then have to commit an atrocity. So, as a secularist, in order to uphold your values, should you be passive against somebody like Stalin?
Right. Right. That's a big problem.
But then he's
Yeah.
going to continue his atrocities.
Right.
So you would have to then create an atrocity to prevent further atrocities from happening, even though your specific, the one that you would be committing would be, I guess, far less on the scale than the ones that he would continue to commit. You would still nonetheless be committing an atrocity, which would be holding you back from your vision of utopia.
Yeah.
Do
That's
you,
that's a good point. That I think what you're getting at there is that vengeance does come out of the notion of justice. Like, we believe in justice, therefore we want vengeance.
yeah,
Like, people see vengeance as just.
people do see vengeance. It's just, yeah, like
The
vengeance. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But so I think the driving factor behind it is seeking for justice. And obviously you can make arguments about what goes too far, but I think the real solution to that a again a level of goodness that so exceeds evil, even if we can't even comprehend the enormities of evil that we see. But there's a goodness that so supersedes and exceeds that it can uh shut off vengeance. It can say, no, no, you don't need to do vengeance. Like,
Wow.
it's taken care of. Justice is taken care of without vengeance. And that's
Wow.
next to incomprehensible.
That
So,
is, yeah, that is, that is. I mean, because then it's like, if given the opportunity to enact vengeance and it's within your control, and you know that if I were to enact this vengeance, uh, further atrocities would cease to be committed, uh, and you don't do anything. What if you, and again, this is speculation, we can say, well, what if you were the tool, the embodiment of the tool necessary to enact vengeance? But
right.
because you didn't associate yourself with that, it didn't happen, and then further atrocities were to be committed. I mean, that's kind of that is a fantastic debate to get into in terms of um, the role vengeance plays, and the allowance of atrocities to be committed, and individual passivity. And I think that's a big one today too. I mean, we see a whole bunch. I mean, we've talked about this before, just tremendous atrocities being committed around the world that just make your blood boil. And here we are, doop, 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 and going to our 9 to 5 job, punching in, paying our taxes, doop, 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 knowing in the back of your mind, kids are being trafficked. Hey, there's a market for human organs, for body parts. It's just crazy things, and it's like, well, what do yeah, I guess it's going on.
Right.
So it's just kind of getting into that idea of, what are then the at what point, and what is something to be done, and is the true I guess the idea of secularism, is that meant to not do anything? Like, are you supposed to be passive and to allow things to happen, or is it within the secularist ideology to actually seek out vengeance against atrocities?
Well, no, I think this is a great illustration, just the way that we've been talking extemporaneously. Like we didn't plan this. We're just spitballing off this idea and seeing where it goes. But this is the exact kind of conversation that is leads to the downfall of secularism, because again, secularism isn't a coherent set of ideas. The way that we have it instantiated in the modern time does have an emphasis on pacifism and on not exceeding the rule of law. And those are good, are good things within certain bounds, and you can make arguments on that. But the issue is within secularism, there is no support for that. And you're going to have this conversation. Some people are going to sit down and have this conversation, and they're probably going to get into some utilitarian philosophy and try to weigh goods. And there's a whole issue with that. But again, that's sort of all secularists have on the table. And there, like you were saying, there's just going to be a point where you're like, guys, no, like something has to be done. That's what it comes to. And secularism has no real response to that other than no, we're not supposed to do anything about it because just because.
Right, like the
And,
utopian.
and so that like if you like secularism is not a coherent set of values. It does not give us the answer to all the things. Harari says it gives us all the values we could want. No, it doesn't. It does not supply us with a sufficient worldview in order to deal with these questions. And it absolutely drives you to the point where if you're just thinking about the world, you will conclude that drastic action needs to be taken. Again, it's kind of like what we were talking about with utopia. They want drastic utopia right now to solve the problems that are being brought up by nihilism. Same thing. A rational person would sit down and come to the conclusion that drastic vengeance is required. That's completely a rational point to come to. And secularism has no true foundational justified reason to forestall that. They just have dogma of no, that's not a good idea because social contract. Like if I see a video of a kid getting raped, I don't care about social contract. Like that doesn't mean anything to me at that point. So, and the reality is that exists out there whether you look at a video of it or not. So yeah, I mean, secularism is just, there's just no question about it. It does not provide the foundation that people pretend it does.
Well, Rob, this conversation got extremely meaty, and I want to continue the momentum that we have here. So why don't we do this? We're gonna have to wrap this up right now. So we'll go ahead and do our outro. But why don't we, instead of diving directly into the next chapter for our next conversation, why don't we see if we can get a back half, because there is an additional one third of this chapter that we have yet to go over that is just as spicy, muy caliente, that I think we need to touch on before we continue further along in the book. So just to wrap this up, ladies and gentlemen, the book is Purpose Informed, the Necessary Basis of All Ethics by Robert B. Davis II. You can find this book on Amazon. I will leave a link in the description below. If you do search it on Amazon in the search bar, you will have to put in Purpose Inform Robert B. Davis for it to generate. It's not going to do it if you just put Purpose Inform. Also, there will be a link to Rob's website as well down there if you'd like to get to know him a little bit more, find out about his other works and other things that he may or may not be working on. More to come maybe about that. Rob, do you have any questions, or do you have anything to say before we close this out?
Yeah, let me read this quote because I think it goes right into what we were talking about is, secularism doesn't have a backstop, doesn't have a full stallment. Well, what might be something that would do that. And this is what I'm proposing. This is a quote from Leo Tolstoy. Man may regard himself as an animal living among animals by the day, or he may think of himself as a member of a family or society or a nation that lives for centuries. Or he may find himself obliged, because his reason drives him irresistibly to it, to regard himself as a part of an infinite universe living in infinite time. And therefore, in respect of the infinitely small phenomena of life that influence behavior, a rational person must do what in mathematics is called integration. That is, establish a relation to the immediate issues of life, uh, a relation to the entire infinite universe in time and space, conceiving of it as a whole. And the relationship established by man to that whole, of which he feels himself a part and from which he draws guidance for his behavior, is that which has been and is called religion. And therefore, religion has always been and cannot cease to be an essential and indisposable condition for the life of rational humanity.
Ooh,
So,
an excellent quote.
tying back to the idea of infinity as the as holding the hope for something that might actually forestall such rational conclusions as vengeance, the horrors of the world leading to nihilism or antinatalism, um, even the wants for globalist utopia or even local utopia. I think it's an integration with the infinite is what we're looking for, and that's what we're aiming at.
And Tolstoy does a good job at tying that into, as I believe you pointed out in the introduction, the necessity of religion.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. So we'll touch back up on this. We'll maybe label this one a part one, and then maybe the second one we'll do a part two, or we'll do maybe just a small portion before we get into the next chapter. But I honestly, personally, I think maybe we should just do a part two of this chapter, and then go into the next chapter afterwards. I think we got plenty of meat on this bone to go through still.
Okay. Yep. We'll figure it out.
Okay. All right. Well, have a great evening, Rob, and we'll do this again next week.
Yep.
All right, everybody. God bless, and may peace be with you.